The 20-year period from 1996 to 2015 is, especially when considering variables like integration, expansion, divisions, multiple playoff rounds, and free agency, inarguably the most successful two-decade run in Cardinals history. Over that span, the team won 1,783 games, with only 1,455 losses, a .543 winning percentage in the regular season, third best in all of baseball, reaching the playoffs 13 times with 9 division titles, 10 if you count the co-division championship of 2001, making 10 trips to the NLCS, capturing 4 NL pennants and 2 world championships. They went 71-64 in the postseason, a .526 winning percentage, easily the most playoff wins of any National League club, and second only to the Yankees. There were home run records set, the arrival and establishment of 2 future Hall of Famers, lopsided trades galore, a Cy Young Award season, 3 MVP seasons, 66 All-Stars, Navy road caps for almost the entirety of the run, a new, albeit underwhelming, ballpark, and the knowledge that if you were going to make it to the World Series in the National League, you were very likely going to have to go through St. Louis to do so. It was, by any measure, an incredible time to be a St. Louis Cardinals fan. Now, as much as we might fondly remember the '96 team, or the 2000 team, or the 2011 team, there is no doubt about which team was the best team during that stretch, because undoubtedly it was the 2004 squad. The '04 Cardinals were so good that it is doubtful that many of us will ever see another one that matches it in our lifetime, and as such, I think they're worthy of a look back.
Da-da-da-da-da-da-dum.
When the DeWitt-Hanser Group agreed to buy the Cardinals from Anheuser-Busch following the 1995 season, the fortunes of the franchise changed quickly. Sweeping changes were made on the field, off the field, and to the field itself. The team added a dozen new faces to the roster and overhauled the entire coaching staff, bringing Tony La Russa and Dave Duncan over from the Oakland A's. At season's end, the Cardinals found themselves atop the NL Central and in the playoffs for the first time in a decade. They would get to within a win of the World Series. By the way, I did a rather extensive review of that '96 team, which I will link to in the description box below. After the '96 season, the club signed Delino DeShields to play second, and despite a spring training guarantee from Tony La Russa that the club would repeat as NL Central champs in '97, they didn't. The season, while below .500, was not a total loss, however, as Mark McGwire's arrival at the trade deadline brought genuine excitement to Busch Memorial. He would be the center of attention in the second half of '97, and then light the entire baseball world on fire with his 70 home runs for a barely above .500 Cardinals team in 1998, then follow that up with 65 more long balls for a bad club in 1999. Despite the lack of team success in the late 90s, as the calendar flipped from '99 to 2000, there was a lot of optimism amongst Cardinals fans. After being focused almost entirely on Mark McGwire's exploits at the end of the 20th century, ownership had reinvested the money it made during Big Mac's traveling home run emporium into the on-field product, bringing in players like Darryl Kyle, Dave Veers, Fernando Vina, and Pat Henkin via trade, and reuniting with a couple of former Cardinals in Andy Benes and Sean Dunston via free agency. When added to a roster that already featured shortstop Edgar Renteria, acquired from the Marlins prior to the '99 season, Fernando Tatis, a trade deadline acquisition from Texas in '98, Ray Lankford, Eric Davis, J.D. Drew, Placido Polanco, Mark McGwire, and rookie pitching sensation Rick Ankiel, the Cards seem poised to return to the top of the NL Central. Those dreams were even further solidified when Walt Jocketty stole Jim Edmonds from the Angels for Kent Bottenfield and Adam Kennedy just 11 days prior to the start of that season. Edmonds and the Cardinals came out of the gate blistering hot, and like Edmonds' good friend Mark McGwire, the due-to-be-a-free agent at season's end Edmonds fell in love with St. Louis, decided he wanted to stay, and signed an extension for well below market value in mid-May. At that year's trade deadline, the Cards bolstered their bullpen by picking up Mike Timlin from Baltimore and Jason Christensen from Pittsburgh, and with Mark McGwire's right knee consistently keeping him out of the lineup, Will Clark was acquired from the Orioles to fill in, and the Thrill did more than simply fill in what turned out to be the final 51 games of his career. With the Cardinals, Clark hit .345 with 12 homers, 42 ribbies, and a 1.081 OPS, helping lead the Cardinals to the NL Central title and sweeping the Braves in the division series before sadly falling to the Mets in the NLCS. 2001 saw some kid named Pujols come up from AAA after only one season in the minors and announce his presence with authority. A late-season surge that year, spurred on by the waiver trade deadline acquisition of Woody Williams from San Diego in exchange for outfielder Ray Langford, propelled the Cards to a co-Central Division title and a wild-card berth. Following an agonizing first-round defeat, which I did an entire video on, link to that is also in the description, the Cards were dealt another blow when Mark McGwire somewhat unexpectedly retired, leaving a huge hole at first base. While many of us were pining for another former Oakland Athletic first baseman, Jason Giambi, a good friend of McGwire's, to be Big Mac's successor, we settled for longtime Yankees stalwart and 2001 World Series Game 4 hero, Tino Martinez. The club did sign one former Oaklander, though, bringing Jason Isringhausen aboard to be the club's closer. In their first ever attempt at engaging with the Asian market, St. Louis also signed Japanese outfielder So Taguchi. The 2002 season was wrought with emotions, good and bad. On the positive side, the Cardinals pulled off another Jocketty special, acquiring and extending future Hall of Fame third baseman Scott Rowland from the Phillies, starting pitcher Chuck Finley from the Indians, and pulling Rick White off the scrap heap and then watching him turn into a lights-out reliever. Andy Benes, who had been so bad and so hurt in the early part of that season that the team had quite literally sent him home, was called back into action in mid-July and somehow went 10-5 with a 1.86 ERA over the final 2.5 months of the season. On the downside, the team said goodbye to their longtime broadcaster Jack Buck in mid-June, and then 4 days later, shockingly, horrifyingly, inexplicably, to their pitching ace, Darryl Kyle. Just say JFB or DK57 to any Cardinals fan following the team in 2002, and they know exactly what you're talking about. Despite the crushing loss of a leader and teammate, the Cards would rally, winning 57 games, Kyle's uniform number, after his untimely death, to capture the NL Central crown, sweeping reigning World Series champion Arizona in the division series, and then losing to the son-of-a-bitchin' Giants in the NLCS. Heading into 2003, it felt like Tony La Russa and company had some unfinished business to attend to, and there was reason to believe that 2003 would be the year to get it done. A full year of Scott Rowland, along with Tino Martinez now being adjusted to life in the National League, sounded promising, and the signing of starting pitcher Brett Tomko felt like another Dave Duncan project bound to pay dividends. Side note, the team also signed former Toronto right-hander Chris Carpenter, knowing fully well that he was more than likely not going to pitch at all that year. Despite Albert Pujols winning the batting title, finishing second in the MVP voting, and putting up 8.7 B-WAR, Woody Williams having a sensational year on the mound and not too bad of one at the plate either, and Edgar Renteria having the best year of his career, both the rotation and the bullpen lacked proper depth in 2003. Fernando Vina on the defensive side played only one game between May 26th and September 1st. Outfield depth addition Orlando Palmeiro was a bust, Dave Duncan's efforts to fix Brett Tomko failed, and Tino Martinez was even more of a disappointment, and an asshole, than he had been in 2002. The Cardinals found themselves tied for the divisional lead on September 1st, but in a series beginning that day, they dropped 4 out of 5 against the Cubs at Wrigley and never again got higher than third, which is ultimately where they finished, missing the playoffs entirely. Remember when finishing third meant you had no shot at the playoffs? To add insult to injury, the arch-rival Cubs clinched the division with former Cardinals closer Dave Veers on the mound. And side note, yes, that's current Cardinals play-by-play guy Chip Carey on the Cubs call.
Look at that mob scene on the turf at Wrigley Field.
I know some of you really like Chip, but if I'm honest, I really don't. Not only do I genuinely not care for how he calls a game, but his voice, as somebody that grew up in eastern Iowa, Cubs territory, is literally the soundtrack that I learned to hate the Cubs by. So I watch a lot of games on mute these days. Needless to say, whatever business the Cardinals had left over from 2002 was not going to be resolved in 2003. By the time the 03 offseason rolled around, any optimism that had been present at the start of that year was completely inverted. The only solace felt among the St. Louis faithful came from reliving Chicago's blown 3-1 NLCS lead. But that solace was quickly washed away by the realization that both the Cubs and the second-place finisher Houston Astros had stacked rosters with significantly more pitching depth than did the Cardinals. St. Louis appeared to have more questions than answers all the way around. Is Bo Hart really an everyday big league second baseman? What do you do about malcontent Tino Martinez? How do you fix the pitching depth? Who bats leadoff in 2004? Will J.D. Drew be closer to the 2001 version in 04 because it's his walk year, or will he continue to be disappointing? Who do they add for the bench? And, oh yes, there was this little matter of the Albert Pujols contract status. After 2003, Pujols was arbitration eligible for the first time in his career, and he was due to get a rather hefty raise from the $900,000 he had made that year. There were whispers that the Cardinals might be unwilling or unable to pay Pujols what he was worth long-term. I can distinctly recall an ESPN discussion panel where one prognosticator suggested that the Cardinals should, could, and probably would trade Pujols to a team like the Yankees that would be willing to pay him. When it came time to exchange arbitration numbers, the Cards submitted a $7 million salary, while Pujols asked for $10.5 million. Since the turn of the century, St. Louis had adopted a policy of not going to arbitration hearings if at all possible. But with the February 20th deadline for reaching an agreement looming, it did not appear as if that policy was going to hold. Then, seemingly out of the blue, just one day before the two sides were set to meet in court, the Cardinals announced that they had agreed to a 7-year, $100 million extension with a club option for 2011. I remember being both relieved that they got a deal done and a little concerned that it wasn't, say, a 10-year extension with a club option for 2014, but either way, at the very least, they had locked a cornerstone piece into place for the better part of the next decade. As for the other divisional foes during the 03-04 offseason, the rich just kept getting richer, as the Astros imported both Andy Pettitte and Roger Clemens from New York to team up with Roy Oswalt and Wade Miller, giving the Astros a very strong starting rotation. Now, if the Astros staff was dominant, then the bevy of arms on the north side of Chicago looked downright lethal. In 2003, the Cubs' top 4 leaders in WAR, pitchers and position players combined, were their top 4 starters: Mark Pryor, Kerry Wood, Carlos Zambrano, and Matt Clement. To that mix, they brought future Hall of Famer Greg Maddux back to Chicago. Gross. The Cubs lineup for 04 featured Moises Alou, Sammy Sosa, Mark Grudzielanek, Cardinals killer Aramis Ramirez, and newcomer Derek Lee. The Astros lineup had Lance Berkman, Craig Biggio, Jeff Bagwell, Morgan Ensberg, Jeff Kent, and Brad Ausmus. The Cardinals? Well, at the end of the 03 season, they had Edmonds, Roland, Pujols, Renteria, Bo Hart, Tino Martinez, Mike Matheny, and J.D. Drew as their starters, which is not exactly a murderer's row outside of the middle third of that lineup. Their 2003 rotation had, at points, featured Woody Williams, Brett Tomko, Garrett Stevenson, Sterling Hitchcock, Matt Morris, and a youngster named Dan Herron. It wasn't horrendous, but it wasn't exciting either, nor could it come close to matching the firepower of both the Houston and the Chicago rotations. It appeared to many pundits and fans alike that no matter what St. Louis was going to do in the 03-04 offseason, they would be looking at a very large uphill climb in the following season if they wanted to return to prominence. But if you've got Tony La Russa in the dugout and Walt Jocketty running your front office, you're not going to stand at the bottom of the hill and stare upward. You're going to try and climb to the top. The first significant move of the offseason came on November 21st, when the Cardinals created an addition by subtraction, sending Tino Martinez to Tampa Bay for 2 minor league pitchers that had no chance of ever seeing the big leagues. The move allowed the Cardinals to slide Albert Pujols from left field over to first base, a move that would prove to be incredibly beneficial going forward. The team re-signed starting pitcher Chris Carpenter with the intent of having him actually pitch in 2004, as well as reuniting with bullpen arms Cal Eldred and Steve Klein. The biggest move of the offseason came on December 13th, when the Cards sent J.D. Drew and Eli Marrero to the Braves in exchange for starting pitcher Jason Marquis, relief pitcher Ray King, and a top minor league pitching prospect named Adam Wainwright. Whatever happened to him? The reaction by most Cardinals fans to Drew being sent out of town was either "Good, get his lazy ass out of here," or "No, he's got so much talent, why would you do that?" Well, why they did that is threefold. One, Tony was not the biggest fan of J.D. Drew, and as we would find out a few years later with Scott Rowland, if Tony didn't like you, talent be damned, you were probably going to be sent packing. 2, it addressed a massive hole in the rotation for 2004 while also adding a starter with promise and team control for the future. It also added more depth to the left side of the bullpen, as Ray King would be a definitive upgrade over Jeff Facero. And third and finally, J.D. Drew was in the final year of arbitration eligibility, meaning that he would be due for free agency after the 04 season, and there was a less than zero chance that he would have re-signed with St. Louis, not only because of the friction between Drew and La Russa, but also because the Cardinals were not going to be willing to pay what he and his agent Scott Boras were going to ask for. Drew had easily the best year of his career in 04 with the Braves, putting up 8.3 B-WAR, which is nearly 3 WAR higher than his next best season, and then left Atlanta for a 5-year, $55 million deal with the Dodgers that featured an opt-out clause after year 2. When adjusting for inflation, that's about a $90 million price tag. In modern baseball, that's actually alright, but the way baseball thinking was back then, there was no way the Cardinals were going to hand a guy like J.D. Drew that kind of money. Drew would exercise his opt-out clause after 06 and sign another 5-year deal, this time with the Boston Red Sox for $70 million or $108 million in today's money. All in all, Drew's tenure in St. Louis showed flashes of brilliance, but he ultimately never stayed healthy or consistent enough to become the guy that we all thought he would be, though I think had he come up in 2018 instead of 1998 with advanced metrics being a thing, we all would probably have had a much kinder view of him. Other offseason moves saw the Cardinals sign Jeff Suppan to flesh out the rotation, Julian Tavares and Mike Lincoln for the bullpen, the bench being strengthened by bringing back former Cardinals John Mabry and Ray Lankford, the latter of whom had sat out the 03 season, and giving power-hitting veteran outfielder Greg Vaughn a non-roster invite to spring training. Reggie Sanders, starting his 7th consecutive year with a different team, yes, that's correct, 7 straight years with a different team, was signed to play right field, and veteran infielder Marlon Anderson was brought in to compete with Bo Hart for the second base job. Garrett Stevenson, Brett Tomko, Sterling Hitchcock, Jeff Facero, Orlando Palmeiro, Russ Springer, Joe Girardi, Esteban Yan, Fernando Vina, Miguel Cairo, and Eduardo Perez all left via free agency or retirement. Spring training in 04 went about as well as could be expected, with Ray Lankford winning the starting left fielder job and Greg Vaughn winning a trip back into free agency. The cloudiest positional area was second base, where Marlon Anderson and Bo Hart both struggled mightily to grab hold of the position. Feeling as if their in-house options were not enough to remedy the situation, the Cards pulled off a trade with Boston for Tony Womack near the end of camp, a mere 5 weeks after Womack had signed with the Red Sox in the first place. Fun fact, even though he never played in a regular season game with Boston, there is actually a Tony Womack Boston Red Sox card. La Russa immediately gave Womack the starting job at second base because he was a veteran and that's what Tony liked to do. Womack would end up rewarding that decision by having what was, by far, the best season of his career in 2004, much to the surprise of just about anyone that had ever seen him play up to that point. The best description of Tony Womack I've ever read, for those not old enough to truly remember his playing days, was written by Gabe Simmons over at Viva Albertos. He wrote, quote, "I'll say this, and I am not in any way exaggerating this point when I say it, Tony Womack was a terrible baseball player. If you were to construct a baseball player to purposefully fool front offices before everyone used sabermetrics, Tony Womack would be what you would produce. Tony Womack had a .273 average, which can and obviously did fool teams into thinking he was alright on offense. The problem was that he never walked, and he also had zero power during the steroid era. And he also wasn't good on defense." End quote. All of that is exceptionally true for Womack, except for in 2004, when he would put up 3.3 B-WAR, hit .307, had a .735 OPS, which was higher than Edgar Renteria's that year, by the way, stole 26 bases, hit 5 homers, and was worth 1.1 B-WAR defensively. I mean, go figure. Also of note, the Cardinals made a minor trade the night before the season started, acquiring spare outfielder Roger Cedeno from the New York Mets. Cedeno's career was pretty nondescript beyond his speed, allowing him to steal 66 bases for the Mets in 1999 and 55 bases for the Tigers in 2001. The 2004 season started at home against Milwaukee, with former Texas Rangers owner, friend of the DeWitt family, noted warmonger, and 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush, throwing out the first pitch. And much like Bush's second term in office, the entire day stunk, with the club dropping an 8-6 decision and ultimately 3 out of 4 to the eventual 94-loss Brewers. Ugh. As ugly as that first series was, the team immediately turned around and swept Arizona on the road, before coming home and being swept by Houston. That's pretty indicative of how things would go for the Redbirds in the early part of the 04 season. Back and forth, up and down, always settling around 500, never getting more than 4 games over or more than 2 games under. After beating the Expos in what would prove to be their final game ever in Montreal on May 9th, the Cardinals found themselves at 16-16, 4.5 games out of first, and in 4th place. On May 26th, St. Louis dropped an 11-8 decision at home to the Pirates, which left them at 1 game over 500 and in 5th place. The lineup was hot and cold, the bullpen was decent enough, but it did feature some leaks, specifically Mike Lincoln and Kiko Calero. The starting rotation was inconsistent, with many losses featuring the frustrating trend of a pretty good start being derailed by one horrific inning. With less than 2 weeks to go before June started, it appeared to many as if the preseason predictions that had the Cardinals finishing a very distant third to the Cubs and Astros would potentially have been generous. But my, how things changed when the calendar flipped to June. Thanks to an offense ignited by the trio of Pujols, Edmonds, and Roland, the Cardinals started scoring big and consistently. We all know that group was dubbed the MV3, but have you ever actually looked at just how sick those three were in 2004? It is disgusting. The starting rotation became consistent, if less than overpowering, with Jason Marquis and Chris Carpenter being standouts, and the bullpen became Fort Knox lockdown good, with Ray King and Steve Klein forming a potent left-handed relief corps, and Julian Tavares and Jason Isringhausen being the standouts from the right side. Reggie Sanders was a solid contributor in right, and while Mike Matheny and Edgar Renteria had down years, they were still valuable pieces. The Cardinals got hot in June, going 19-9 and climbing from 2.5 out at the start of the month to 3.5 ahead at the end of it. Oh, and they called up some kid named Molina that month too. The only bit of bad news the Cards got in June was on the 24th, when the Houston Astros acquired Carlos Beltran in a 3-team swap with Kansas City and Oakland. But hey, how big of a difference can one guy make, am I right? Things continued to roll along the river in July, with the Redbirds opening up an 8-game lead on second-place Chicago, heading into a 2-game series at Wrigley the 19th and 20th of that month. In an odd scheduling quirk, it was the last 2 games between those teams that year, despite them being rivals and there still being over a third of the season remaining. The Cardinals, going into that series, had a chance to bury the Cubs, at least in the divisional race, with a 2-game sweep, which would have left the Cubs 10 games out with no head-to-head matchups remaining. A split, and from the Cardinals side, you'd feel pretty good about things. A sweep by the Cubs, well, that divisional lead, while still pretty sizable at 6, would not feel nearly as cozy with another 68 games to play. The series would become the Cardinals' definitive regular season statement. The first of the 2 matchups pitted Carlos Zambrano against Chris Carpenter. Zambrano, or Big Z, as my Cubs fan mother liked to call him, had emerged as the best starting pitcher that the Cubs had in 2004. Better than Pryor, better than Wood, and at that point in his career, better even than Greg Maddux. He was undoubtedly one of the best starting pitchers of that era, period. And it pains me to say, but he was better than our own Chris Carpenter, and go check Baseball Reference if you don't believe me. Not only was Zambrano a really, really good pitcher, but the dude could hit too. Truly, the biggest issue with Zambrano was his inability to control his temper, and that lack of maturity would be at the center of Game 1. To begin the opener, Carlos Zambrano struggled with his command, walking Tony Womack and Albert Pujols before plunking Jim Edmonds. It would not be the last time that Carlos Zambrano would throw a baseball in the general vicinity of Jim Edmonds' person on this night. Neither side would score until the fourth, when after a Scott Rowland base hit and an E5, Jim Edmonds drove the first pitch he saw from Zambrano out of Wrigley for a 2-0 Cardinals lead. As you can see here, Zambrano was not a big fan of Edmonds admiring his handiwork. A Renteria solo homer in the fifth made it 3-0, but the Cubs would tie the game in the bottom of the inning thanks to Zambrano helping himself with a single, a Mark Grudzalonic sac fly, and a 2 RBI hit by Moises Alou. When Edmonds faced Zambrano again in the sixth and struck out swinging, it felt like the worm had kind of turned in the wrong direction in this series. The Cardinals seemingly never played well at Wrigley, and Carpenter had looked kind of shaky in the fifth. However, there was very little noise from either side until the top of the eighth. In that frame, Tony Womack walked for the second time in the game. A pass ball moved him to second, and then, of course, Renteria was then asked by La Russa to bunt Womack to third because it was 2004, and why wouldn't you move a runner who's a speed guy and already in scoring position over to third in exchange for an out? Makes all the sense in the world. Pujols then struck out swinging, leaving it up to Scott Rowland to try and put St. Louis back on top, which he did with this bomb to left center. The very next batter was Edmonds, and Zambrano hit him intentionally, which made absolutely no sense whatsoever and got him ejected from the game. Carpenter allowed an Alou solo homer in the bottom of the inning to bring Chicago within one. Remember when starting pitchers would pitch into the eighth? But Izzy shut the door in the ninth, and the Cardinals had themselves a guarantee of no worse than a split and a 9-game divisional lead going into the finale. As dramatic as the opener of this brief 2-game set was, it had nothing on the sheer joy that would follow in Game 2. The finale had the perpetually overrated Matt Morris going against journeyman lefty Glendon Rush, who was in the midst of the best year he would ever have. Former Cub Tony Womack walked to lead off the game and was bunted by Edgar Renteria to second base before being driven home on a double by Pujols to make it 1-0 Cardinals. In the bottom of the second, with that 1-0 lead still intact, the wheels fell off for Matt Morris. A walk to Alou, a home run by Lee, a double by Ramirez, a home run by Barrett, a strikeout, a single by Rush, a walk, a double by Patterson, a pop-out, a wild pitch, and an RBI single by Alou ended the day for... Wait, what? He was allowed to face 11 batters that inning? Holy shit, that would never happen today. Anyway, Morris ate it, giving up 7 earned runs and 1 2/3 innings pitched. He was replaced by Cal Eldred, who struck out Lee to end the frame. The Cardinals got one back in the top of the third on an Albert Pujols solo homer to make it 7-2, but the Cubs returned the favor with an Aramis Ramirez solo shot to make it 8-2 Cubs. The game settled down at that point, with neither side having another man touch the plate through the fifth. From the view of this Cardinals fan, it felt like one of those days where your starter just doesn't have it, the game becomes a blowout early, you throw your veteran longman out there to eat some innings, and you take the series split and move on with life, content to know that you will not have to see this team again for the remainder of the regular season. With most teams, in most years, that's probably what would have happened. But this was 2004, damn it, and the Cardinals had been defying expectations all season long. So why stop now? In the sixth, Pujols led off with his third hit of the day, a single to center. Rowland followed with a single to left, and Jim Edmonds drove Pujols home with a single to right that put runners at the corners and made it an 8-3 game. Rush was then replaced by Francis Beltran, who promptly walked Sanders to load the bases, then walked Matheny to force in a run, making it 8-4. So Taguchi, getting the day game after a night game start and left over Ray Langford, then hit an infield single off of the pitcher's glove that brought Edmonds home to make it an 8-5 affair. Langford was then summoned to hit in the pitcher's spot against former Cardinal Kent Merker, and Ray just missed hitting a grand slam, settling instead for a sac fly that made it 8-6. Womack struck out swinging, and Renteria flied out to right center to end the frame, but at this point, you felt like things were starting to head in your direction. Kiko Colero, who after a rocky start to the year had become an invaluable arm out of the bullpen, worked 2 hitless innings of relief in the 6th and the 7th. Pujols extended his perfect day in the 7th with a solo homer off of Kyle Farnsworth that cut the deficit to 1, and in the 8th, So Taguchi knocked one of only 3 balls he would hit out of the yard all year, also against Kyle Farnsworth, into the bleachers to tie the game at 8. In the 9th, Renteria led off with a single, and then Albert Pujols put the cap on what would go down as the greatest single-game performance of his career with this at-bat. 5 for 5, 3 home runs, 5 runs driven in, and with this performance, a death nail to the Chicago Cubs' 2004 Central Division hopes. Reggie Sanders would add some insurance with a solo homer later in the inning, and Izzy came on for the save, making it more interesting than was needed, but still getting the job done as per usual. And with that win, there was no debate that the Cardinals were the best team in the National League. The question was this the best team in baseball? The Cardinals finished out July strong, going 20-5 overall and ending the month 30 games over 500 and 10.5 up in the division. At the Midsummer Classic in Houston that month, the Cardinals sent 3 representatives, Albert Pujols, Scott Rowland, and Edgar Renteria, and the Cardinals drove in 3 out of the 4 runs that the National League would score in the 9-4 ass-whooping by the American League. As the trade deadline approached, fans were wondering what could possibly be done to add to the strength of this team. The Cardinals had been among the most active mid-season transaction teams since 1997, but the deadline passed, and nothing happened in St. Louis. Oh well, how could you possibly make this team any better anyway, right? The Astros, who had made their big move in June in acquiring Beltran, were also quiet at the deadline, but the Cubs, despite being dead in the divisional race, decided to go for it, being just 2 games out on the wild card, and stunned everybody by pulling off a last-minute deadline trade for longtime Boston Red Sox shortstop Nomar Garciaparra. I remember there being a fear amongst Cardinals fans, and it was even echoed by longtime broadcaster Joe Buck, that the Cardinals would win the division and then ultimately lose to Chicago in the NLCS. The Garciaparra move did not help to soothe any of those nerves. Still, the Cardinals were in the catbird seat, and there was no sense in dwelling on future what-ifs in that moment. The lack of an addition at the deadline did not seem to have much impact on the Cardinals' performance, as the team went 5-1 in the first week after the deadline. Things didn't feel like they could be going any better. But then, on August 6th, the Cardinals announced that they had pulled off a post-deadline trade with Colorado for future Hall of Famer Larry Walker. Holy shit. Larry Walker. The dude was a former MVP. The man was a perennial all-star. He was a Gold Glove Award winner. This meant that Reggie Sanders would slide over to left field where his arm was much better suited, and Langford would move to the bench, and your starting outfield would be Sanders in left, Edmonds in center, and Walker in right. Walker instantly increased the depth of the lineup, and I honestly do not think I will ever see a more dangerous 2 through 5 in the Cardinals batting order than Walker, Pujols, Edmonds, and Rowland. God almighty, that's a loaded bunch. With Walker on board, the Cardinals coasted easily to the NL Central crown, finishing the regular season with 105 wins and 13 games ahead of the second-place finisher and wildcard champion Houston Astros, and 16 games in front of the, guess you can forget about seeking revenge in the NLCS, Chicago Cubs. The only thing that soured the optimism felt by Cardinals fans heading into the postseason was the loss of Chris Carpenter, who was shut down for the remainder of the regular season and the playoffs after experiencing nerve issues in his shoulder in mid-September. The loss of Carpenter in the rotation was significant, to be sure, but the team was confident that they could win in spite of his absence. The Cards' Division Series matchup pitted them against the Los Angeles Dodgers, the pre-Holy Christ, can you please stop being this good every damn year Dodgers. The Cardinals made quick work of the Los Angeles crew, blowing them out by 8-3 finals in Game 1 and Game 2 in St. Louis, then dropping Game 3 against old Houston foe Jose Lima, before winning convincingly 6-2 in Game 4 behind 7 strong innings from Jeff Suppan and home runs by Reggie Sanders and Albert Pujols. The Division Series win sent the Cardinals to their 3rd NLCS appearance in 5 years, and this time, their opponent would be the intra-division Houston Astros. As mentioned previously, coming into the season, it appeared as if the Astros starting rotation was loaded, but newcomer Andy Pettitte had been struggling with an undiagnosed torn flexor tendon for much of the season before he was ultimately lost for the year on August 18th. Roger Clemens pretty much lived up to his billing, and Roy Oswalt had been very solid, but the rest of the Houston starting 5 left something to be desired by the time October rolled around. Houston had slugged their way to the wildcard berth, charging hard in August and going 23-7 over their final 30 games to surpass Chicago for the wildcard spot on September 29th. In mid-July, when the Astros were severely sagging in the standings, they fired their manager Jimmy Williams and replaced him with former Brewers and Tigers manager Phil Garner. Scrap Iron, as he was known during his playing days, turned out to be the miracle cure for Houston's ails, as did Astros hitting coach and former Cardinal Gary Gaetti, who never looked right in that Astros uniform. Newcomer and free agent-to-be Carlos Beltran had proven to be a godsend, hitting 23 homers, stealing 28 bags without getting caught once, and posting 4.5 B-WAR in only 90 games with the Astros. Houston had gone 10-8 against the Cardinals during the regular season and had swept St. Louis in their most recent meeting at the end of September. Both lineups could mash. Both teams were missing one of their best starting pitchers, both teams had a solid closer, but the Cardinals had a distinct advantage in the middle of their rotation and in the middle relief portion of their bullpen. The Astros division series against Atlanta had gone the full 5 games, which was good news for the Cardinals because that meant that Clemens and Oswalt could not start until games 3 and 4, which meant that the Cardinals were going to have a distinct advantage in games 1 and 2. Game 1 in St. Louis demonstrated almost immediately what a giant pain in the ass Carlos Beltran was to be in this series, as his 2-run homer off of Cards starter Woody Williams in the top of the first gave Houston a quick lead. Pujols countered with a 2-run homer of his own against Astros starter Brandon Backey in the bottom of the inning to tie the game up, before Jeff Kent homered off of Williams in the fourth to put Houston back ahead by 2. A Larry Walker RBI double and a Scott Rowland RBI single tied the game in the fifth before the Cardinals staged an uprising in the bottom of the sixth. In that frame, Cedeno, Womack, and Walker drove in single runs, with Edmonds delivering a bases-clearing double to put the game out of reach. Lance by golly he's good Berkman hit a 2-run homer in the 8th to make it 10-6, and a Mike Lamb solo shot in the 9th made it 10-7, which would be the final score, which gave St. Louis a 1-0 lead in the series. Game 2 saw Matt Morris starting against Peter Monroe, the second straight day in which Houston had to start someone less than ideal. Despite the seemingly lopsided pitching matchup, Houston found themselves holding a 3-0 lead in the 5th thanks to solo homers by Carlos Beltran and Morgan Ensberg, and an RBI single by Lance friggin' Berkman. In the bottom of the 5th, the Cardinals responded with 2-run homers by Larry Walker and Scott Rowland to put St. Louis in front by a run. An Ensberg single in the 7th drove in Berkman to tie the game at 4, where it would stay until the bottom of the 8th, when Albert Pujols and Scott Rowland hit back-to-back homers to give St. Louis a 6-4 lead, and 1 inning later, a 6-4 victory, and a 2-0 series advantage heading to Texas. I remember breathing a huge sigh of relief after the Game 2 victory because I was pretty damn confident that they were not going to beat Clemens in Game 3, and I did not feel too good about their ability to beat Oswalt in Game 4 either. Game 3 in Houston got off to a nice start when Larry Walker took the rocket deep in the top of the first for a 1-0 St. Louis lead, but a single and a walk to lead off the bottom of the first against Jeff Suppan put Houston in a good spot to respond, and after getting Jeff Bagwell to ground into a double play and putting themselves 1 out away from leaving the first unscathed, a Lance fucking Berkman single tied the game, and a Jeff Kent homer put the Astros up by 2. Jim Edmonds hit a long ball of his own to lead off the second that brought St. Louis to within a run, but that would be the last time a Cardinals player would cross the plate in Game 3. The game remained 3-2 into the bottom of the 8th when Beltran and fucking Berkman both hit solo homers to make it 5-2 and put the game out of reach. The Cardinals did end up with the tying run at the plate in the person of pinch hitter John Mabry in the 9th, but he struck out swinging to end the game and get Houston back into the series. I mean, oh well, you lost the Clemens start in Houston, not ideal, but you can't realistically expect to sweep Houston with Roger Clemens on the mound, right? So go out there and get him in Game 4. And in Game 4, the Cardinals, yet again, found themselves in a good spot early, this time scoring 3 off of Roy Oswalt in the top of the first on a 2-run homer by Pujols, followed by an RBI single a short time later from John Mabry. Card starter Jason Marquis allowed an RBI double by Bagwell in the bottom half, but no further damage. Jim Edmonds drove home Pujols with a sac fly in the third to put St. Louis back up by 3, but that rat bastard Lance Berkman, remember how much we hated Lance Berkman when he was an Astro, drew Houston to within a run thanks to a 2-run double. In the fourth, Pujols singled home Tony Womack to make it 5-3 St. Louis. It would remain that way until the 6th when damn it, Lance, son of a bitch, asshole Berkman again hit a solo home run off of Kiko Calero to trim the Cardinals' lead to 1, and then Raul Chavez, who the hell is that, singled home future Cardinals legend Jose Vizcaíno with the tying run. The Cards had the go-ahead run at second with nobody out in the top of the 7th, but failed to score. In the bottom of the inning, Carlos Beltran somehow managed to golf this Julian Tavares pitch over the wall for a go-ahead solo homer without so much as one bang on a trash can to let him know it was coming. Tavares was so upset that he quite literally punched the steel-plated dugout phone after the inning and broke his non-pitching hand in the process. That one-run lead would hold until the 9th when Brad Lidge shut down the top of the Cardinals' order to give Houston a 6-5 victory and tie the series at 2 wins apiece. This was an incredibly frustrating game to watch. Roy Oswalt gave up 5 runs. You should probably go ahead and win the game in which the other team's co-ace gives you a 5 spot. The Cards left 8 men on base, and Jason Marquis could not get out of the 5th inning. This was a chance to go up 3-1, and they just didn't take advantage of it. Still, keeping things in perspective, not all was totally lost. Houston was back to the weak portion of their starting staff, and you had gotten through the Clemens and Oswalt games with the series tied, which if you had been told before the series that you could guarantee that you would be 2-2 after 4, I think both sides would have said, yeah, we'll take that. The hope in Game 5 was that the Cardinals would go out there and kick Brandon's backy side. Hey, I'm a dad. I'm allowed to make that joke. Now, when it comes to whether or not they actually kicked anybody's backside in Game 5, let's just say that they did not. Now, in fairness, for 8 1/3 innings, neither did Houston, because Game 5 turned out to be a gorgeous, beautiful, oldie-fashioned pitcher's duel, a rematch of Woody Williams and Brandon Backy's Game 1 start that was the complete opposite of their first meeting. Both starters were brilliant. For the Astros, Backy went 8 shutout innings and did not allow a hit until this Tony Womack single in the 6th broke up the no-no. He faced 3 batters over the minimum and did not allow a runner past second base. Woody Williams, on the other side, pitched 7 shutout innings, faced 4 batters over the minimum, and he too did not allow a runner past second base. The game remained a 0-0 deadlock into the bottom of the 9th. In that frame, Jason Isringhausen, on for his 2nd inning of work, allowed a leadoff single to Beltran, because of course he did, got Bagwell to fly to center, saw Beltran steal second, then issued an intentional walk to motherfucker Lance Berkman to put 2 on with 1 out to bring Jeff Kent to the plate. On the first pitch Izzy threw to Kent, this happened.
Kent waits. In the air, we go to St. Louis with Houston in front 3-2.
I can vividly remember being in my college dorm room, watching Kent holding up his finger saying, one more, and then being 1,000% positive that he and the Astros were going to get that one more win. This loss, while a great game within a vacuum, was an absolute crusher, and it made the implications of the Game 4 failure shine even more brightly. Now, the Cardinals had no margin for error. Now, the Cardinals knew that they were going to have to beat Roger Clemens in order to get to the World Series. Now, you were relying on Matt Morris to channel his inner 2001 in Game 6 and then hope that Suppan could be brilliant in Game 7. The Cardinals needed the offense, which had been asleep at the wheel for the last 14 innings, to wake up, and they needed the back end of the bullpen to be airtight. In Game 6, as mentioned a moment ago, Matt Morris started for St. Louis opposite Peter Monroe. In the first, that rat bastard asshole Lance Berkman put the Astros up 1-0 on a sac fly that scored who else? Carlos Beltran. In the bottom half, as he had done all postseason long, Albert Pujols responded, this time hitting a 2-run homer that put the Cardinals up by a run. The Astros tied the game in the third on a Jeff Bagwell double to left, but Edgar Renteria put St. Louis ahead with a 2 RBI single in the bottom of that same inning. A Mike Lamb solo homer leading off the fourth cut the lead to 1, and the Cardinals had a potential run cut down at the plate in the bottom of the inning when Pujols ran through a stop sign on a roll-in single that ricocheted off the sidewall. In the fifth, the Cardinals got a double by Sanders, which caused Astros manager Phil Garner to intentionally walk Mike Matheny to bring up Morris' spot. In hindsight, I think Gardner probably would have been better off pitching to the light-hitting Matheny, because had Matheny made the third out, which was pretty likely, La Russa would have been forced to decide if he wanted to send Morris back out there for the sixth, which he very well might have, which probably would have been advantageous to Houston because that would have allowed them to stay with the Cardinals starter instead of getting into the very strong Cardinals bullpen. But either way, Mabry pinch hit for Morris and struck out swinging to end the fake rally. In the eighth, Jason Isringhausen was brought into the game for his second consecutive multi-inning appearance. He worked around a one-out double by Jeff Kent to preserve the lead in the eighth and came back out in the ninth to try and send the Cardinals to a Game 7. Morgan Ensberg was hit with a 2-2 pitch to open the frame. Eric Bruntlett was then called upon to pinch hit and bunt the tying run into scoring position, which he did successfully. Craig Biggio then flew to left, leaving St. Louis with only 1 out to go, but the always dangerous Carlos Beltran standing in the way. The decision was made to intentionally walk Beltran to pitch to the physically compromised Bagwell. Normally, I would not love this move, but I think this was a perfectly fine time to issue an IBB. Unfortunately, Isringhausen threw a dead center fastball to Bagwell on the first pitch, and he ripped it into left field to tie the game, causing Isringhausen to ask our Lord and Savior to bring damnation upon the proceedings. A double steal followed, and with first base now open, La Russa opted to pitch to pain-in-the-ass Berkman, who thankfully struck out to limit the damage. The Cardinals failed to score in the ninth, and neither side did a damn thing in the 10th or the 11th. In the 12th, Julian Tavares, broken left-hand at all, worked a second consecutive scoreless inning of relief, setting up the 3-4-5 hitters in the Cardinals lineup for the bottom half. Facing Dan Maselli, Albert Pujols walked, Scott Rowland fouled out, and then on an 0-1 pitch, Jim Edmonds cemented himself into Cardinals playoff lore.
During the regular season. And we are going to Game 7 in the National League Championship Series.
The Cardinals had survived. Not only had they survived, but they had worn down Houston's already sagging bullpen. They had managed to ensure themselves of a Game 7 showdown and a chance to best Roger Clemens for the right to represent the National League in the World Series for the first time since 1987. One batter into Game 7, however, the trend of the road team scoring in the opening frame continued as Craig Biggio homered down the left field line off of Suppan to make it 1-0 Astros and immediately give the Cardinals an, albeit admittedly small, hole to dig out of. In the top of the second with 2 on and 1 out, and Brad Ausmus at the plate, Jim Edmonds made a play that not only stopped the Houston momentum in that inning, but undoubtedly saved the series for St. Louis. If that ball gets by Edmonds, considering that Clemens is on deck, it's highly likely that the Astros would have sent Vizcaino, and considering the weak arm of Sanders in left, who probably would have been the one that picked the ball up after Edmonds fell to the ground if he had not been able to catch it, Vizcaino probably would have scored, and that would have made it 3-0 Houston with only 1 out and a runner at second base. Instead, because Edmonds made this catch, it remained 1-0, with 2 out and runners at first and second with the pitcher spot up next. There is no overstating this. If Edmonds does not catch that ball, the Cardinals do not win this game. Now, as wonderful as that play was, it did not prevent Edmonds from making a throwing error in the top of the next inning that did allow a Houston run to score, giving the Astros a 2-0 lead. In the bottom of the third, Jeff Suppan executed a squeeze play beautifully, bringing home Tony Womack to cut the lead in half. The Astros put 2 on with nobody out in the fourth, but failed to score. The Cardinals had 2 on and 1 out in their half of the fifth, and they too failed to score. Heading into the sixth, with Suppan's spot due first, it really felt like the Cardinals needed to make their move, and to make it quickly. The longer the game went, the stronger Clemens had always seemed to get in October. If only the Cardinals had somebody on their bench with good lifetime numbers against Roger Clemens to pinch hit for Suppan in this spot. Wait, what? They do? Who? Roger Cedeno? Wait a minute. Look at this here. Holy cow. At this point in his career, Roger Cedeno was 10 for 24 with 6 walks against Roger Clemens. I mean, Cedeno was a marginal at best player, and he owned a guy who, were it not for steroids, would be in the Hall of Fame? I mean, that's pretty incredible. And those trends would play out very well here as Cedeno led off the inning with a single up the middle. It is very easy to forget the role that Roger Cedeno played in this inning. Not only did he single to lead off the inning representing the tying run, but he irritated the shit out of Clemens as a runner at first base, drawing 3 throws before the first pitch to Renteria, as well as a step-off and a throw over before the second pitch, both of which were balls, by the way, and then another step-off and a throw over before the third pitch, which Renteria fouled off, then another step-off before Renteria bunted the fourth pitch of the at-bat to move Cedeno to second. That is 3 step-offs and 5 throw-overs in the span of one batter. For a guy that liked to control everything happening on the field when he pitched, that's an awful lot of letting somebody live rent-free in your head. How much impact did that have on this inning? I have no earthly idea, but I do find it interesting. After the Renteria bunt, Larry Walker tapped back to Clemens, putting the tying run at third with 2 outs for Albert Pujols. On a 1-2 pitch, Pujols lined a ball down the left field line, bringing home Cedeno and tying the game at 2. On the very next pitch, Scott Rowland jumped on a fastball and drove it out down the left field line to give the Cardinals a 4-2 lead. Pandemonium set in at Busch Memorial as the realization that the Cardinals, who entered the inning down by 1, were now 9 defensive outs away from reaching the World Series for the first time in 17 years, took hold of the crowd. After Edman struck out to end the frame, Kiko Calero and Julian Tavares worked scoreless 7th and 8th innings respectively. In the bottom of the 8th, Marlon Anderson led off with a double, and then La Russa, playing once again for only 1 run, decided to bunt the already in scoring position Anderson to third, with Renteria at the plate, which seemed to be a theme in this series, and Anderson was then driven home on a single to right by Larry Walker that probably would have scored him had he been at second base anyway. Regardless, it was a very important insurance run, which Jason Isringhausen came on in the 9th to try and protect. He got Jeff Kent to pop out to second, and Morgan Ensberg to fly out to center, which brought up Jose Vizcaino, representing the Astros' last chance.
On the ground to second. And for the first time since 1987, the St. Louis Cardinals are going to the World Series.
The exuberance I personally felt as Womack threw the ball to Pujols was unlike anything I had ever experienced as a fan. This was not the first time the Cardinals had won a pennant in my lifetime, but it was the first time I was old enough to remember it happening. I kept thinking about how awesome it was to be a Cardinals fan and how this felt like the best team I'd ever seen and how much I loved watching these guys play. It was just an incredible feeling, and I ended up celebrating very late into that night. The NLCS was, by any measure, incredible. It featured slugfests, pitcher's duels, walk-off homers, blown saves, extra innings, both teams crawling back from the brink of elimination, and the only reason it isn't remembered by many outside of St. Louis and Houston is because of what happened in the ALCS that same year, where the Red Sox had overcome a 0-3 series deficit to defeat the Yankees and head to the World Series, where they would face the Cardinals in the team's first World Series matchup since 1967. Before Game 1 at Fenway Park, I remember talking to one of my friends, and he asked me, "Don't you think the Cardinals' pitching is going to be a little bit gassed after that series?" And my response was, maybe. Little did I know how gassed the pitching staff was going to be after that 7-game NLCS, but I also had no idea how tired the team in general was going to be after their hotel accommodations changed last minute upon their arrival in Boston. The team did not get in until 2 a.m. the day of Game 1. The hotel they thought they were staying at was not the hotel they were actually staying at, and they were located about 40 miles outside of Boston. And to top that off, room service was not available for the players upon their arrival. Game 1 saw the Cardinals down 7-2 after only 3 innings, with starting pitcher Woody Williams in what would prove to be his final appearance as a Redbird, giving up all 7 runs in 2 1/3 innings pitched. The offense did battle back to make it 7-5 in the fourth and tied the game at 7 in the sixth. Boston took another lead at 9-7 in the bottom of the seventh, but in the eighth, the Cardinals mustered up the strength to mount yet another comeback. With one out, Mike Matheny singled, which prompted Boston manager Terry Francona to pull former Cardinal Mike Timlin in favor of Alan Embry. The Cardinals countered by pinch-hitting Roger Cedeno for So Taguchi and having pitcher Jason Marquis run for Matheny. Cedeno singled to right, putting 2 on and only 1 out. Francona went back to the bullpen yet again. Remember when there wasn't the stupid fucking 3-batter minimum? This time to get his closer Keith Foulke, hoping to have him get 5 outs and secure the Game 1 victory. Edgar Renteria greeted Foulke with a single to left, which featured a bobble by Manny Ramirez, which allowed Marquis to score and cut the Boston lead to 9-8. Larry Walker then hit a fly ball to left, and for the second consecutive play, Manny Ramirez was credited with an error, this time evidently getting his spike stuck in the Fenway turf, which allowed Cedeno to score the tying run and put runners at second and third with only 1 out, with Pujols, Rolen, and Edmonds due up. This was a chance to take a lead in a game they had no business even being close in, much less ahead, and a chance to send a message to the Red Sox that, God damn it, we're not the Yankees, we're not going to fold up softly and just go away. So what happened? Well, in a pick-your-poison move, Boston decided to intentionally walk Pujols to load up the bases for Scott Rolen. And on the first pitch that he saw, Rolen popped out to third. 2 down. That was a gut punch. The Red Sox, give them credit, did a brilliant job of taking advantage of the Cardinals' aggressiveness in RBI situations. That's something I've talked about before in other videos. They threw a ball to Rolen in the exact perfect spot to get Scott Rolen to get himself out. And they didn't throw him an up-and-in fastball. They threw him an up-and-in changeup, which was perfect because the only thing that he could do in that situation is either swing through it or hit a weak little pop-up. Edmonds followed Rolen's at-bat by striking out looking to end the inning. At that moment, the game was tied, but I kind of felt like it was over. In the bottom of that inning, Julian Tavares gave up a cheapy, pesky-pull 2-run homer to former Cub Mark Bellhorn, which put Boston ahead for good as they would take Game 1 and signaled the beginning of the end of the 2004 Cardinals. The Redbirds dropped a rather uncompetitive Game 2 by a 6-2 final, and then headed for St. Louis, hoping that some home cooking would cure their ails. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Trailing in the third inning of Game 3 1-0, St. Louis had the tying run at third and the go-ahead run at second with Larry Walker at the plate. Walker hit a ground ball to second, and with the infield playing at normal depth and conceding the run, the Cardinals absolutely should have tied the game. Instead, Jeff Suppan, who was the runner at third base, did not break for the plate soon enough, had to try and scramble back to the bag at third, and was tagged out, turning what should have been an RBI groundout into a brain-dead, rally-killing double play. Apparently the Jeff Suppan word of the day on this particular evening was fuck up. If the Bellhorn homer was the start of the nail being driven into the coffin, the inexcusably bad base running by Suppan was what finished the job. Larry Walker did homer in the 9th inning of that game, and that would prove to be the last run that the Cardinals would score in the year of our Lord 2004. And speaking of Larry Walker, he was pretty much the only Cardinal to do dick offensively in that series, and it's a real tragedy that his .357 batting average, .438 on base, .929 slug, and .1366 OPS with 2 homers went to waste. Game 4 saw Johnny Jesus Damon leading off with a solo homer, and that would pretty much be all she wrote as the Cardinals went out with a mighty whimper, losing 3-0 in the game and 4-0 in the series. It was an absolutely awful way for a magical season to end. In the immediate aftermath, I was crushed. This team was special. This team was supposed to win the whole thing, not Boston. I mean, shit, they were the better of the 2 teams in the World Series. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But as we Cardinals fans found out in 2006 and 2011, sometimes baseball doesn't work out the way you expect, and it's not always the best team that wins. But once the sting of the World Series flop faded, it was easy to be very thankful that we had gotten to watch a team do all of the great things that the '04 Cardinals did. Big changes would be made before the 2005 season, the final year the Cardinals would call Busch Memorial home. Ray Lankford retired. Again. Edgar Renteria, the Cardinals shortstop for the previous 6 seasons, was allowed to walk via free agency, and he signed with the Boston fucking Red Sox. To replace him, the Cardinals signed non-tendered Angels shortstop David Eckstein. That one actually worked out pretty well. Tony Womack, after having had his career year in his lone season with St. Louis, cashed in via a 2-year deal with the New York Yankees and promptly turned back into a very skinny pumpkin. He was replaced by former Expo, Dodger, and Cub Mark Grudzielanek, who, like Womack before him, would have the best year of his career in his lone season with St. Louis before immediately leaving via free agency the following winter. Steve Klein, a member of the bullpen since 2001, was also let go, and he signed with the Baltimore Orioles. Mike Matheny left to sign with the San Francisco Giants. The team also made what was, at least in the very, very short term, a massive upgrade to their rotation, acquiring Mark Mulder from the Oakland A's for Kiko Calero, Dan Herron, and Derek Barton. Perhaps the most seemingly insignificant but ultimately substantial signing of that offseason was Abraham Nunez, who, up until that point, had been a lifetime Pittsburgh Pirate. And not a very good one either. All Nunez would do in his lone season with St. Louis is have the best year of his career. Is there an echo in here, by the way? And proved to be invaluable at third base, filling in for Scott Rowland when a collision at first in May ended any real effectiveness Rowland would have for the remainder of the year. 2005 would see the club enjoy a full season from Larry Walker, Albert Pujols win the first of 3 NL MVPs, Chris Carpenter win the Cy Young Award, the team win 100 regular season games and claim yet another NL Central Division title, and celebrate the 40-year history of Busch Memorial Stadium all season long. After sweeping San Diego in the 2005 Division Series, they would fall in 6 games to the Astros in the NLCS, failing in their quest to repeat as NL champs, and ending the life of Busch II. While the '05 Cardinals were a lot of fun to watch, they just didn't have the same spark that the '04 squad did. Maybe it was because everybody expected them to be good in '05 and nobody had in '04. Maybe it was because Rowland was healthy all year in '04 but not in '05. Maybe there was just some intangible it factor that the '04 squad had. I'm not exactly sure. But I do know that to this day, the 2004 Cardinals are my favorite squad ever, even more so than the 2011 bunch, and while their story didn't have the perfect ending, the lead into the final chapter was pretty fucking awesome. Thanks for watching, friends. Spring training games are just around the corner, and even though the Cardinals are likely to suck ass yet again this year, I can't wait. I'm not sure when my next original content will come out, but I do know the subject. Players that have long careers with a brief stop of no more than 1 or 2 seasons with the Redbirds. I'm tentatively calling it Cameo Cardinals. So until then, be well, and once again, thanks for watching. Oh, and fuck the Cubs.